First of all, I need to acknowledge the support of the Fulbright program. In 2014, I had a Fulbright to the UK, which permitted me to write this book. Right now, I'm on a Fulbright in Adelaide, which is allowing me to finish up the galleys on a second book and write the sequel to this book. It's an extraordinary program. And what's important about the Fulbright program is that it is available to you all as well. There are Australian students who take advantage of the Fulbright program to study in the US. So I would encourage you to put that on your agenda as something that you think you might want to explore. 4 months ago, I vetted the applications from the UK for students who want to come to the US. And one of the things that I noted there, well, actually, there are a couple things. One is that everybody wanted to go to the Kennedy School in Boston. And there's much more to the United States than just the Kennedy School in Boston. But the other thing was that many of the applicants were really quite smart about the way that they structured their applications, so that most of them had already been accepted at a graduate program in the United States, and having been accepted, deferred attendance. So the sequence was apply to a US university, become accepted, and then include that in your Fulbright application. So it looks much more well constructed. So that is the invitation to you all. It's really an extraordinary program. It is a timely program insofar as right now, if you follow US news, what you see is a focus on building walls as opposed to building bridges. And the Fulbright program is designed to build bridges. You can be part of that. Okay. I'm delighted to be back in Sydney. A couple of weeks ago, I was here speaking with your former Prime Minister, John Howard, about American healthcare. You are fortunate in having an elder statesman who's still alert, still engaged in politics. You may disagree with Liberal Party priorities, et cetera, but nonetheless, this is an important development insofar as my observation as sometime political science is that one of the purposes of political parties is to serve as stewards with regard to the social infrastructure that we inherit. And I think that John Howard is someone who is attentive to that, and it's really important. At the time that we spoke, the Affordable Care Act was in the balance, at the precipice, and I was able to generate a bit of humor by quoting Jim McDermott, who is a Democratic politician from Washington State, who watched at all of the machinations that were going on within the Republican Party around the Affordable Care Act. And Jim McDermott's comment is, oh yeah, the Republicans are going to repeal Obamacare and replace it with the Affordable Care Act. No, they didn't even get as far as replacing it with something else. So that turned out to be an astute observation. At any rate, it's nice to be back in Sydney. So what I'd like to do is work through a series of slides which are based on my work. Dynamic Welfare State, Oxford University Press, 2016. This is a book that includes a theory of the welfare state, which I'll overview in a moment. I just finished the galleys for Pandora's Dilemma, Theories of Social Welfare for the 21st Century, which will be out, I guess, in October. At the moment, I'm completing the last chapter of the sequel to this book, which is the name of that book is Thrive, How Social Investment Promotes Well-Being, and that's the second part of the presentation today. What we're going to do is go through three different aspects of where I think the welfare state has been and where it's going. The first part is a review of theoretical work with regard to the welfare state, which we inherited from the 20th century. It's important to recognize that the welfare state that we inherited was a product of the surpluses that were generated through industrialization. There were a number of presumptions with regard to the welfare state, which have encumbered it and made it less and less credible as an institution, so that the social infrastructure that we've inherited is less and less capable of realizing some of the ideals that its promoters had offered during the 20th century. And then the question is begged, well, what might a sequel be? And I think that for better or for worse, the idea of investment appeals and maybe a sequel to the welfare state. Okay, so the decline of the welfare state. We'll start with Stephen Hawking once said, anytime you insert a formula in a presentation, you lose half of the audience within 5 minutes. So these are simple ordinal relationships that I think are pretty compelling. The first one comes from Thomas Piketty's majestic book, Capital in the 21st Century. Thomas Piketty, the French economist, began with R is greater than G. Return on investment is greater than economic growth. And when I saw that, I was just transfixed. And 600 pages later, I thought, well, but wait a minute, what is the application of this to the welfare state? And it occurred to me that there are a sequence of other ordinal relationships that help explain the problem that we've inherited. So, let's see if I can get this going the right way. Consequences of R is greater than G, as Piketty suggested, rising inequality. So that if you look at the decades during the last century, what you see before the First World War, very high economic inequality. And then after the Great Recession, the Second World War, that reduces significantly. And then after 1980, what do we see but an uptick in economic inequality once again? And Piketty is notable for observing he's not certain that there is an end point to this, the economic inequality that we're experiencing right now may eclipse the economic inequality of before the First World War. So that becomes really important as a consideration. The idea that mid-20th century we were able to moderate inequality, and yet just at the point the welfare state begins to expand institutionally, what happens? Well, inequality starts to take off, which is counterintuitive with regard to institutional design. A second consideration has to do with the precariat. Many of you as students, probably not unlike the students that I've had in the United States, you're burdened with student debt. You're working one job, you're working two jobs. You're eating lunch during the presentation. Classic precariat behavior. I'm serious. I'm serious about this. This is directly applicable to you all, and it's directly applicable to students in the US, it's directly applicable to students in the UK. Everybody is struggling economically because the old presumption that you would somehow be able to secure a position in the labor market that offered a salary, that offered benefits, that offered a career and upward mobility, all bets are off, right? So today's undergraduate degree is the last generation's high school diploma. Carry that logic forward. So what is tomorrow's undergraduate degree going to require in terms of upward mobility? Well, graduate school. And who's going to pay for that? You all are going to pay for it. So this presents real problems with regard to the welfare state as regards to the labor market. And part of this is a result of fewer government supports. Okay. While we have an expansion in the precariat, we also have increased affluence on the part of, in the US, what's referred to simplistically as the 1%, as opposed to you all, which represent, I don't want to offend anybody here who's extraordinarily wealthy. You know, we got the have-nots and the have-yachts. Any have-yachts here? No. Okay. I don't belong to either category. I'm a have-kayak. So so these nominal distinctions are somewhat simplistic. But nonetheless, we have extraordinary increases in income and wealth in the United States, perhaps less so in Australia. It's extraordinarily high in the UK. And I can tell you impressionistically that when I was in the UK in 2014, biking to my office at the University of Birmingham, traffic was just brutal. And one of the biggest hazards were all the foreign cars. I mean, we're talking expensive foreign cars. What would nominally be race cars on the streets in Birmingham. So extraordinary amounts of wealth that accompany this R is greater than G. And of course, people who are generating this much wealth have to put it someplace. So where do they invest? And one of the things that I followed in my work, which is chronicled in the American experience here, has to do with investments in health and human services. This is in part an artifact of the way America established healthcare in 1965 through Medicare and Medicaid, decided to do it on the cheap in order to prosecute a war in Vietnam. But what that meant was that the federal government was going to reimburse private providers. So what happens within the next 2-3 decades is an expansion of a market in healthcare in the United States as the largest, most dynamic healthcare market probably on the planet. And you can be sure they're looking at acquisition opportunities in Australia. Okay. The next proposition, C is greater than S, where C is capital and S is state sovereignty. This is a no-brainer insofar as capital is mobile. Sovereign nations are geographically anchored. Labor is somewhat mobile, but much less so than capital. So it becomes increasingly difficult for nations to maintain their fiscal commitments with regard to social programs if capital is able to leave and the abandonment of capital, the hemorrhaging of finance, et cetera, becomes really problematic, not just between countries, but also within countries. So you get bidding wars, if you will, to make sure that an automobile assembly plant or a financial institution doesn't leave, because what goes with that is incredible amounts of capital. So what are the costs, consequences of C Trump? That guy is really insidious. He just gets into everything. Economists refer to this as inversions, which is to say companies set up headquarters overseas in order to dodge tax liability. One of the most interesting developments in the last couple of months has been Panama Papers. If you followed that issue, what you see is that there are people, and not just in banana republics, we're not talking about sub-Saharan African kleptocrats who are secreting money in Swiss bank accounts necessarily. We're talking about people who are sometimes relatively affluent. They just want to dodge their tax obligation. What I find so interesting about the Panama Papers is that this referred to one company in Panama. And to the extent that I explored this, I think there are several hundred of these companies that specialize in sheltering money that would otherwise be taxed for social purpose. My favorite example of this I refer to as the Depardieu effect. You remember Gerard Depardieu, an enormously entertaining, aging French comic who was faced with a prospective 75% tax rate when Premier Hollande suggested he was going to start soaking the rich in France. And immediately, Depardieu changed his citizenship. He's now a citizen of Russia and dropped his tax rate to 13%. Now, is that extraordinary or what? You can imagine Gerard Depardieu laughing to the bank. Yeah, okay. And of course, to the extent that money hemorrhages from national sovereign governments, what that means is that individuals and small businesses who are not able to take advantage of those inversions have to pick up the tab. And that means you too. As a result of this, the only way that governments can meet their mandated obligations in terms of social benefits and social services is to engage in deficit spending. If you're not going to raise taxes, the only way we can meet those mandated obligations is to increase deficits. And this becomes really problematic with the inception of the GFC, because at that point, many national governments are so steeped in red ink that they can't engage in Keynesian responses to the extent that they were able to 5 decades before during the Great Depression. So this idea of maxing out deficit spending becomes an important consideration. Okay. Whoops, the other one. Third proposition, B is greater than I, where B is bureaucracy and I is innovation. This is all about path dependence. If you're a public policy student, you would pursue this. Path dependence, an institutional equivalent of inertia, which is says that after programs are established and they develop broad constituents as consumers, and when I say broad, I mean in the millions. What you have is a fiscal pipeline that is enormous. You end up with large groups of constituents who are represented by advocacy organizations or trade associations, and you also have battalions of civil servants who are delivering services. And those commitments, under conditions of having maxed out deficit spending, lead to rationing services. That is almost inevitable as a consequence. And as a corollary, what you see is that innovations get squeezed out. In the United States, we have a number of different innovations that have been really very positive with respect to constructive outcomes, cost benefit, and yet these are left in essentially a demonstration mode. And it's impossible to think about bringing these to scale nationally because there are inadequate resources. Essentially, the path dependency of existing institutions have captured so much resource that there's relatively little to offer for program innovation. Okay, this is where things really start to get controversial. Proposition 4, where H is harm and W is well-being. This is not a good place to be. That agents of the state or their contractors end up inflicting damage on citizens on behalf of allegedly improving their circumstances, which is what the welfare state was predicated to do. We see that in the United States, particularly as regards to juvenile justice, where a significant number of minority African American and Hispanic young men are locked up, and then their careers starting in juvenile justice end up metastasizing into adult corrections. And we have people who are virtually precluded from engaging socially with the mainstream. Because once you're a felon in the United States, the prospects of employment are essentially foreclosed. That is also a problem in Australia. Yeah, I think of juveniles who are incarcerated, 25% are Aboriginal peoples. That's a figure that I saw at a conference here a week or so ago. Last night, I don't know if you watched Four Corners, but there were graphic illustrations from Lifestyle Solutions and Autism Plus of people who are disabled, who are essentially abused, seriously abused, and yet astonishingly, public agents representing the public seem to be waffling and cavilling in response to this, rather than being assertive about defending this population. So this becomes enormously difficult as a public institution. If you have, and I'll cite the American Trinity, public schools, which are free and compulsory, where large numbers of kids don't learn. And in fact, if you look at inner city schools, a lot of students actually drop out, which is a terrible investment of public funds. If you look at care for the mentally ill, in the 1970s and the 1980s in the United States, we experimented with a deinstitutionalization initiative, of which I was an enthusiastic professional promoting that. The rug was pulled out from under that initiative because it was not adequately thought out with regard to closing state institutions, the effect of psychoactive medication. And as a result, we have tens of thousands of seriously mentally ill people in the United States who are living under bridges. At this point in time, the largest mental health facilities in the United States are the Los Angeles County Jail, the Cook County Jail, and Rikers Island. What's wrong with this picture? So we have examples where what we have done through public policy has not been optimal. It's not just been suboptimal. In fact, it's damaged citizens. And I think that if you are a citizen exposed to this, as a taxpayer, and you see kids hanging out on the street corner, they're not going to school, they're getting arrested instead. If you see delinquents graduating, as the term is sometimes used, into adult corrections, and you find people who are homeless, who are obviously having serious difficulties in managing their affairs, to the point that they're addicted to different substances, and they're being arrested with frequency. I think most taxpayers would look at this and shake their heads. And this becomes a real problem with regard to the welfare state. So a consequence of this, as these things become additive, as you might suspect, is that we get a rationing of social services and benefits. The public is less willing to front resources that are necessary for our public commitments. I mentioned juvenile incarceration. Child welfare in the United States is in a deplorable condition. I think there are questions about child welfare in Australia as well, from what little I've been able to glean. Notably, in not only the US, the UK, and Australia, we continue to have, as part of our means test, asset limits on public assistance benefits. This goes back over a century. This is not necessary insofar as there are ways of distributing public benefits that evade the means test, the asset test part of the means test. And yet we continue to have this asset requirement for people to get public assistance. And what does that mean? I'm not sure how that works in Australia, but I can tell you in the United States, the asset test is essentially $2,000. So anybody who has a car that is minimally functioning is right at the asset limit. So if you go so far as to buy life insurance, buy a burial plot, you're over the asset limit, and what that means is that your public assistance benefits are terminated unless you liquidate those resources. So this becomes really problematic with regard to the integrity of the welfare state. And as a consequence, I think this further erodes public support for social programs. Fifth proposition, where N is greater than O, N is need, and O is opportunity. Here we have one of the most unexpected consequences, which is the emergence of what I call social markets. If you have low-income people, disproportionately minority, who are adamant, who persevere in terms of their aspirations, they are intent on upward mobility, if not for themselves, their children. But public support through government social programs has been progressively withdrawn. Then there are private vendors who are happy to move into that space and cultivate that market. And what we see in the United States are a variety of different industries, which are really quite large in scale, totaling in 2009 US $319 billion, which is quite a niche market if you think about the scale. But it includes auto title loans, payday loans, check cash, and rental, and furniture, remittances, etc. These are vendors which make financial products available to low-income people who find this essential insofar as they're unable to get credit or financial services from mainstream financial institutions, or having had a miserable experience from mainstream financial institutions. A miserable experience insofar as the hours are not congruent with their work circumstance, with regard to essentially looking down on low-income minority consumers, or extracting extraordinary penalties when people make the mistake of overdrafting checking accounts, for example. So the penalties of financial institutions, mainstream financial institutions, are really quite high. And as a consequence, what you see in many low-income communities in the United States is the evolution of alternative financial services, where the price is high, allegedly because the risk is high. The second consideration here has to do with for-profit education. Here again, I'll have to rely on the American experience, but if you're a low-income person and you need a job that pays a living wage, odds are you're going to need some kind of certification for a position like that. You need to become a welder. You need to become a medical technologist. You need to be a personal care provider. Those certifications can be available. They can be attractive to you, but you're probably going to find commercial vocational schools more likely to offer those certifications than the local public college. Local public college for a 4-year degree is going to require 2 years of general studies, including the humanities. And if you're a low-income person who is concerned about getting a foot on the ladder of upward mobility sooner than later, a 4-year undergraduate degree, at least in an American university, is simply out of the question. So commercial education becomes a viable alternative. What are the implications of this? One is obviously an eroding credibility for the industrial era welfare state. Adolf Wagner, back when T.H. Marshall was making a justification for expansion of the governmental welfare state, thought that government expenditures would track that expansion in social programming. And they had, but I think we've reached a limit. So that, for example, in Australia, government spending as a percent of GDP is 37%, social spending 19.5% of GDP. In the US, it's 35% of government spending and 20% for social purposes. It's unlikely, given the political economy of countries like Australia, like the United States, that we're going to see dramatic increases in that. This presents real problems with regard to future commitments given the retirement of the baby boom generation. I tell my students in the US, I represent 77 million retiring baby boomers. We are going to take advantage of the public pension program. We're going to take advantage of our healthcare program for seniors. Back when these programs were established, maybe 50% of the population even lived to age 65. My generation is indomitable. And my students are going to be stuck with the tab. Yeah, so where is the justice in that? The consequence of all of this is a generational issue with regard to equity. So if this is what we've inherited, then what might a sequel be? So part 2 is the rise of the investment state. There are 5 themes which I think are important. The first one is capability. This is related directly to Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. If you read them, those moral philosophers, they've been getting some recognition for the work that they've done. And I think that capability is evident in different ways in different countries. This is U.S. hourly wages by race, ethnicity, and gender. The conventional understanding of, when I ask my students, so who in the society earns the most? Well, it's obviously white men. Well, no longer is it white men. As this chart indicates, as of about 2000, the lines crossed. At this point in time, it's Asian American men, men who are from China, men who are from India, men who are from other Asian countries have done famously well. And a lot of that wealth has come by dint of becoming professionals, becoming involved in high tech, so that they have prospered much more than white men have. We'll come back to that theme in a moment. But notice also that among women, it's Asian women who outperform white women in the United States. And in fact, Asian men and Asian women outperform just about everybody else. So this is a bit counterintuitive. What's going on here? This is not just economic inequality. There are some other factors in play here, but they're obviously quite important. I didn't include a slide here, which is derived from a study on upward mobility in the UK, which tracked white Brits in relation to white Brits. Upward mobility was eclipsed in descending order by Chinese, probably fugitives from Hong Kong, African Americans from the Caribbean, second, also eclipsing white Brits. Third, Indians. So what you see are some really interesting dynamics with regard to non-white populations and how they have prospered in relation to the general population. This is an extraordinarily important chart of male mortality, courtesy of Ann Case and Angus Deaton. Deaton won a Nobel Prize recently. And what you see here is generally the flow is downward. What we see is that between 1990 and 2010, male mortality has decreased, except for US white men, which is the heavy red line. It begins to follow that slightly downward pattern, and then beginning, oh gosh, what would it be, 1998 or so, it begins to tick up. So here we have white men who are not only losing purchase with regard to social standing, but they're dying sooner. And what's so remarkable about this chart is the dark blue line. USH is US Hispanic men. So you can't blame it on minority status. Essentially what's happened here is US Hispanic men are very much like men in Australia, men in Sweden, men in Germany, men in the UK. They're living longer, but not US white men. So what is that all about? Alcoholism, suicide, drug addiction in the Rust Belt? That's the speculation. Okay. So second consideration here is employee benefits. One of the pleasures of being in Australia is seeing how well you treat workers in your precariat. The minimum wage here as a percent of the median wage is the chart from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And what you find is that the Australian minimum wage is about 50%, maybe a little bit more, than the United States, by comparison, is about, I don't know, 50% less. And that has everything to do with being insecure in the labor market. Because in Australia, not only do you have a decent minimum wage, but you don't have to worry about health insurance because you have universal health care. In the United States, not only do you have a very low minimum wage, but you don't have health insurance. So you find people who are really insecure with regard to membership in that secondary labor market, if you will. A next consideration is evidence. If you followed program evaluation, in the last 20 years, what you've seen is an extraordinary expansion in understanding how program interventions affect people. These are 4 programs. This is benefit cost ratio. This is half of the equation that I suggested a moment ago. The other half of the equation is constructive positive outcomes. And all of these programs, functional family therapy, becoming a man tutoring, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy for schizophrenics, and the nurse-family partnership, all deliver positive outcomes. Not just financial benefits, but positive outcomes. These are good investments that we can make in the United States. And these benefit to cost ratios are really quite significant. So that we can approach a 10-to-1 if we're smart about how we invest public resources. Note, this contrasts significantly with the welfare state, which is essentially indifferent to cost benefit as well as constructive outcomes. The presumption was that professionals knew what was best for the general population. The people who had administrative experience could allocate resources efficiently. And what would come out of that would be the best of all possible worlds. As I suggested a moment ago, that's not the case if you're inflicting harm on citizens. And here we have an antidote for that. We have a way for determining what kind of interventions are constructive with regard to their outcomes and also effective fiscally. Okay, democracy is a fourth consideration. Again, it's wonderful being in Australia. You folks have compulsory voting. I think there are about a dozen countries in the world who have compulsory voting. I think Australia is the only developed country that has compulsory voting. So it's no surprising you have a national election. 90+% people, you all vote, right? Yeah, okay. Oh, that's important. That's important. What does voting do within a democratic polity? But it holds elected officials accountable so that citizens can recall them if they're being imprudent. If you were to compare this to the United States, what you see is the U.S., and this is national elections, so the U.S. is looking pretty good. If you were to examine the U.S. during midterm elections, let alone state elections, God forbid, local elections, what you would see would be significantly lower. Not only that, but because voting in the U.S. is optional, what you'll find is that among people who earn more than $90,000 a year in the U.S., 90% of them vote. Yeah, they're right up here with you all. But among people who are poor, about half of them vote. So what you have as a result of economic inequality interacting with optional voting in the United States is that affluent people have 2 votes effectively for every 1 vote for a poor person. Is it any wonder that you end up with the kind of tax policies, the kind of denizens in the White House that we have at this point in time? This has become my favorite chart. This is percent of seats held by women in national parliaments. Only 2 dates, 1990, 2016. There are a couple of patterns here, obviously. What you see are the Scandinavian countries doing much better with regard to female representation in the national legislature. I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest that this is a good idea. I'm interested in social policy. I've spent a career in social services, and the economists describe this as important because a basic decision that a society makes is the decision around guns or butter. So what you see historically is that overwhelmingly male legislatures end up voting their testosterone and building up these magnificent defense edifices. Whereas what you tend to see in legislatures that have high proportion of female legislators is that there's more resource dedicated to child care, education, home care, all those things that make for a more compassionate and adequate society. Now, there are also, economists suggest, those things that generate more productivity. So there's an economic rationale for this. Australia is doing much better. Among the lower subset, Australia is at the top, a little bit above 30%. Little Iceland here has just done remarkable things, if you think about that. It's just astonishing, from just a little bit above 21% approaching parity in the parliament in Iceland. Now, before we're too smug about what's happened with the developed world, there are a couple of anomalies here. One is Bolivia. 53% of the parliament in Bolivia is female. Rwanda, remember Rwanda? 64%. Yeah. So the way that we manage our polity has everything to do with social programs. Final factor is inclusion. This is walking on really thin ice for a male. Bear with me. The black line running across the chart is the population replacement rate requirement, 2.1 for every fertile female. Okay, that's just demography. This isn't me. This is demography talking. Okay, so, but notice that many of the industrialized countries with more than adequate welfare states, European model welfare states, have experienced a crashing population replacement rate. And why is that? Well, birth control, women entering the labor market, women deciding that there are other things to do with their time other than becoming mothers or postponing motherhood. So this becomes really significant, really significant. This is a demographic transition that's enormously important. The open triangle is 1970, so you find all of the nations essentially falling in terms of population replacement between 1970 and 1995. And then there's a little balancing that's going on here between 1995 and 2014, where we're close to stabilization. But nonetheless, most of the industrialized welfare states are below the population replacement rate. Well, there is a way to correct this without having more children, which is immigration. Here we have immigration cohorts. Obviously, Israel is a country where there's likely to be a large increase in immigration. Israel was established in 1948. Noticeably, Australia does very well, very well. And just walking around Australia, you find incredible diversity within the population. You have diverse language, you have diverse cuisine, you have diverse religious institutions, et cetera, and they seem to be integrated and quite harmonious. Much more so than the US and the UK. And yet, if you look at Japan, what you see is a country that's bordering on xenophobia with regard to its immigration policies. Okay, part 3, real quickly. If we think about social investment, one of the examples that's evolved has been social impact bonds. In Australia, we have had 3 social impact bonds directed at the homeless, one of the most troublesome populations that we have. In Adelaide, they cost about $20,000 per capita per year. When I was walking home from work yesterday, there were 2 emergency vehicles, 5 EMTs dealing with a homeless man who obviously injured his hand. And I was thinking $20,000. He's probably a little higher on the distribution than $20,000. Here in this one incident, this is going to be quite expensive. So anything that can be done through intensive case management to keep people who are homeless out of emergency rooms, to keep them from running afoul of the law and being locked up, is a good thing to do in terms of public expenditure. It's also good for them in terms of personal function. So the Aspire SIB in Adelaide, funded at $9 million through Social Ventures Australia was oversubscribed. In other words, the way that you amount of a bond is you offer investors an opportunity to contribute. These are the terms, 2% per year as a return. And there were sufficient investors that this was oversubscribed, which is a real interesting development. I noted just a couple of days ago that the International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank Group, issued a $500 million global benchmark bond, which is designed to work with peasant women and farmers, as well as energy companies in the developing world, $500 million, which is a significant amount of money in countries like that. So as a thought experiment, as a pragmatist by philosophical disposition, constantly engaging in thought experiments. So this is Australia development accounts. Here's a 2-page discussion paper, which I will distribute. You'll note that it has my email address on the front. I'm open to discussion about this possibility. I've run it by David Crawford at the Treasury. I've run it by Simon Jackman at the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney. I've run it by some people in Adelaide, and their response has been, oh, that's intriguing. So the idea here is that you could put together behavioral economics, asset building, and impact investing, and come up with something that might be universal in Australia. The match for Aboriginal peoples would be 3-to-1. The match for poor Australians would be 2-to-1. For everybody else, it would be 1-to-1, providing that the money that is set aside in a savings account as a default would be used for finishing vocational school or college, buying a first-time home, starting a business. And the argument is that this would be a way in investing in human capital and accelerating upward mobility, using almost all private resources. Government would have a role in authorizing an Australia development account, monitoring the way that those are used. So it would be primarily limited as a regulatory authority. This is, I think, following the SIB that was announced in Adelaide, the kind of thing that we're probably going to be looking at in the future as a way to capitalize social programming. So, hence the investment state, for better or for worse, speculative to some extent, but we're beginning to see real movement in that direction, as evident in the SIB in Adelaide, as evident in the IFC, part of the World Bank Group. So, questions, comments? We have some time.